Did you hear what former Australian of the Year Dylan Alcott had to say yesterday about people rorting the National Disability Insurance Scheme?
In the NDIS, you talked today about lawyers, a lot of money going in legal fees, but there are clear instances of people abusing the scheme.
Yeah, they can go and get stuffed.
Simple as that. So what is rorting of the NDIS, and what can and should be claimed for those who are entitled to funding available through their NDIS plan? It's a plan that helps millions of Australians, more than 4.2 million, I think it is, living with a disability every single day. However, the cost of the scheme has been identified as one of 5 major pressures on the federal budget and is expected to cost more than $166 billion over 4 years. It's been estimated that as much as 15 to 20% of the service's current annual budget might have been misused. That's $6 billion a year. So what is classed as rorting, and what should be claimed under the scheme to help those living with a disability live a more fulfilling life? River Knight is from Developing Australian Communities. He's also a disability advocate. River, great to have you with us this afternoon on ABC Radio Queensland. What are your thoughts on Dylan's fighting words there to those who might be rorting the NDIS?
Hey, thanks for having me, and I absolutely agree. I do love the way that Dylan frames this and is very straightforward with those rorting the system. Now that NDIS is really cracking down on this, it would be the most stupidest crime in the world to commit, because like anything in NDIS, anytime we spend money, there's a paper trail a mile long. So the warning out there for service providers is you will be caught. And we hope that there will be some action taken under the new system that's been rolled out to investigate.
What kind of stories or instances of people rorting the system have you heard about anecdotally?
Well, there's a few different ways to look at it. There's those that deliberately rort and steal funding. There's people who claim things that they just really don't understand that they shouldn't be claiming, which can be really tricky, and a lot of families find themselves in that position. But in terms of the criminals out there, you know, I know lots of stories. I had a case recently where a service provider was funded for 24-hour one-on-one staff for a participant, which costs about $500,000 a year, and they just decided to not provide staff 6 hours a day to that person and left them alone in the house unsupervised. And of course that adds up to $100,000 a year. They still claimed for 24-hour support, but they just didn't provide it. And of course NDIS knew about it. The Guardian then found out about it. Big uproar, huge complaint, and zero consequence for the service provider, except for an action plan that NDIS required them to write themselves to promise that they solemnly swear not to do it again.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, that is the norm. And that's why when we had the backlash a couple of years ago where we looked at the current system and said, well, you know, after all this time, we've only had a couple of people ever actually fined for doing the wrong thing. We need to see real action, because this is criminal behaviour.
It sure is. After last month's budget announcement, an anti-fraud unit from the NDIS was announced. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Fusion Fraud Task Force?
Well, what we're looking at is trying to actually have the hands on deck to investigate, because one of the things that really happens quite a lot is where do we go to complain, which is, of course, the NDIS Commission. But actually investigating, that's a very different minefield for police, for federal police to really look at. So we need a task force that's going to be able to understand what they're looking at, understand how easy it is to rort the system, and also then be able to make people accountable for it. So we do love to hear these things. However, we have not seen a lot of action over the last 8 or 9 years with NDIS, and we certainly are very disappointed that we are now starting to take action on something that everyone in the sector knows happens every single day.
It can be a blurry line between what can and should be subsidised under the scheme, as you said, through each individual's NDIS plan. So how do people navigate that?
It can be really tricky because we've got people who self-manage their plans at times and don't have a service provider to guide them about what they can and can't spend. Certain items over a certain amount, you cannot simply, pay for yourself unless you have certain checks and balances in place. But what we often find is that individual interpretation, and because NDIS is set up so that you can't just contact a local NDIS staff member and say, can I just check with you I've got this right? Because the system is so complex, a lot of families, a lot of people find themselves sometimes claiming stuff they shouldn't. So, for example, we might have a young boy who's 12, with a physical disability in the heart of Brisbane or Sydney, who needs to access gym equipment, who needs to access physio. If you live in suburbia, you have 3 or 4 gyms around you. You can go to the gym, you can go to a physio, you can access Medicare to do that. Claiming, physio equipment, NDIS might come back and say that's not reasonable and necessary. But then you've got a young person, same age in rural Queensland, has no gym nearby, no physio access, no access to OTs. It'd be absolutely reasonable to be able to fund some equipment so that young person can have their early intervention, have that physical support and that physio that they need because they have a right to access that. So in one situation, they may say, you know what, not reasonable and necessary, shouldn't have bought that. In another situation, may be perfectly fine.
Bill Shorten has discussed a common situation for people who have severe physical impairments such as cerebral palsy, using their funding to pay for an escort to visit them in their own home. Now, that might seem a bit odd for some people, but with others with this kind of disability, this is a service and a basic human right that they are and should be entitled to. And that's their social life, their sexual health, their sex life. But, for many people, their severe physical impairment may prevent them from actually going out and finding a partner or being active on dating sites. Is this the kind of thing, I guess, that people struggle to understand when it comes to what the NDIS can pay for?
Sexuality within the disability sector is a topic that people are absolutely petrified to talk about. It's a part of everyone's life. It's sexuality, gender, it's my identity. It's something that it should be easy to look at, and it's not something that people spend a lot of money on. So there's no item in NDIS land that I can actually claim for a sex worker. I can't access escort services and those sorts of things because there's within NDIS land we actually can only claim things that have a number next to them. So there is no item for sex workers. It's something that is a special item that you would have to get special approval for and an invoice for, and it's not something that many people even would consider accessing. But for that small group of people that might need to, again, we want to be able to make an intelligent decision. We don't want to blanket yes or no, we fund this, we don't fund that, because that's what the previous government attempted to do when they tried to change the legislation, and they used sex workers as a scary keyword to try and get people saying, oh, we don't want to fund this, we don't want to fund that. You know what? And that was a really, really disappointing approach, because what they were really doing was trying to tighten the allowances for things like equipment that were perfectly reasonable and necessary. So in some situations, getting support in those spaces, sexuality, all those parts of a person's life might be totally appropriate. But again, it's the minority, it's not the majority, and we don't want to change legislation so that it's just a blanket yes and no approach to say NDIS fund this and they don't fund that under no situation whatsoever.
So, River, if somebody listening this afternoon kind of thinks, look, I believe I know someone who's rorting the system, the NDIS system, how do you actually go about reporting that?
So we don't go to the NDIS as such. You can certainly reach out to those service providers that are in your life if you have someone trustworthy. But what we tend to do nowadays is we have a great system now set up within what we call the NDIS Commission, which is a slightly separate body to the NDIS itself. They look after complaints. You can go online, you can make a complaint online, and they now process that, and they really do action things a lot better than what we saw previously. So we'd say go to the NDIS Commission, that's where you make your complaints, or reach out to an advocacy service. We want people to be able to make complaints, and unfortunately the reason we see a lot of the rorting going on is because the people who don't always have capacity to even know they're being scammed are usually the hot target for someone who wants to rort the system.
River Knight, it's been really interesting speaking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
River Knight, disability advocate and also director of the Developing Australian Communities.